Welcome to our April speaker series in the Masonic Library and Museum in Philadelphia. My name is Alex Morrese. I'm a tour guide here. I'm also a costumer. I run a costume shop and sewing blog dedicated mainly to science fiction and fantasy costumes and historical tailoring. If any of that sounds interesting to you, the website is right there. Today, we're recapping a recent project of mine, an effort to reconstruct a late Victorian Templar uniform frock. And before we can really get started, I'm going to have to define almost every word in that sentence. If I can figure out how to make the slideshow work. There we go. The first step in our background discussion is going to be, who are the Knights Templar? We are, of course, not talking about the real Knights Templar of the Crusades, but a modern fraternal organization. The story here begins with a Scottish lord and French knight named Chevalier Ramsay in the mid-18th century. Ramsay was a member of a number of fraternal orders, including both the Freemasons and a group descended from the Knights Hospitaliers of the Crusades. Ramsay's orations were extremely popular in continental Europe and the British Isles, and directly inspired a group of Freemasons in Ireland to found the Grand Priory of Ireland, a new fraternal order on the Emerald Isle, claiming to be descended from the Templars, or at least inspired by the Templars. This, of course, directly inspired American Freemasons to do the exact same thing, founding the Grand Encampment of the United States in Pennsylvania in 1797. Ramsay's ideas also inspired the pseudo-historical book Born in Blood by John Robinson, claiming that the Templars were descended directly from the Knights Templar of the Crusades following their excommunication and executions. This text inspired Dan Brown's The Lost Symbol and, of course, the film National Treasure. The Irish Templars and the Templars throughout the British Isles dress in what one might expect for a group calling themselves Templars. They dress up like crusaders with tabards and often chainmail and capes. However, their American counterparts did something a bit more interesting. Their uniforms are modeled after contemporary U.S. Army uniforms. Following the Civil War, their regulations became somewhat more fixed than they had been previously. The Grand Encampment set a set of standards. Their uniforms at the time included, as we can see, frock coats. The Templar uniforms in the United States have, to some extent, kept track with contemporary Army dress uniforms. But this style, set in the late 19th century, following the Civil War and remaining popular into the 1930s, is the one we're going to be looking at for the rest of the talk. Now, the Templars did something very interesting here, where they imagined an alternate history where the Templars continued to survive into the modern day and adapted their uniforms to fit contemporary military stylings, making them arguably the world's first cosplay group. And that is where my interest comes in. Of course, the main question before we can begin is, what is a frock coat? Where did they come from and where did they go? The frock coat is descended from the earlier style, the Justacorps, which was popular throughout the 18th century. But at the end of the 18th century, due to a collection of reasons, it stopped being fashionable for men's fashion to include all these lace and frills and trim. For certain reasons, you didn't really want to have this very aristocratic fashion in France in the 1790s. So fashion became a bit more utilitarian, a bit more working class. The era of the breeches and hose was gone. Enter the era of trousers. In addition to that, following the Napoleonic Wars, men's fashion became far more military inspired. The military frock coat itself is descended from the earlier coatee or redingote and the greatcoats that became extremely popular during the Napoleonic Wars. The frock coat of the early 18th century was still very interesting garment, very very flashy silhouette with these wide skirts, big hips, large shoulders with a lot of fullness at the shoulder cap. But as we progress to the 19th century, we see the frock coat begin to adopt the silhouette we would consider a bit more contemporary. But during the 19th century, the frock coat was also supplanted by what was known as a morning coat, or cutaway frock in some places, which was deemed a bit less formal. The morning coat itself was eventually supplanted by the even less formal tuxedo. Yes, there was a time when a tuxedo was considered an informal jacket. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the early 20th century, frock coats were seen almost entirely by very old men at very formal affairs. In the mid-30s, they stopped even being appropriate garb for the royal court in England. The military frock has its own history. We see here a lineup of US Army uniforms from 1775 to 1918. We see again the military coatee or redingote, popular during the Revolutionary War and into the early 19th century. During the War of 1812, the US Army adopted this shield jacket. A jacket in the 19th century was any short coat that did not have tails attached, but the frock coat comes into fashion mid-19th century, where it remains up until the Spanish-American War. But of course, we reach the Great War, and the flashy colors of the 19th century have been replaced by something that actually blends in with your surroundings, hopefully. The beige, olive, drab, and khaki of the Great War. The high collar and slightly longer lower portion of the jacket remain for a little while. You can see that this gentleman is wearing his equipment over the jacket, so it does extend at least to the hips. But those jackets would continue to get shorter and then a bit longer until we reach the more modern stylings. So now we're going to look at frock coats specifically, not their history, but their construction. We have here a Mexican Army frock from the mid-19th century. Now, one of my best sources for this project was the uniform regulations of the Grand Commandery of Kentucky. I am not entirely sure why they were the only ones who published or at least mass distributed their uniform regulations or had their regulations in a great deal of detail. Even these were exceptionally vague, simply saying black fabric, which can mean almost anything. But we see here a at least pretty good example of what they are expecting their uniform frock to look like when it is completed. The best source really is to just go straight to the horse's mouth. What was the Army wearing? They were modeling themselves after Army uniforms. And so we have here two Civil War uniform frocks. Then we can see already a great deal of variability in what is being done. Confederate uniforms were often homemade. The Confederate depot system could not keep up with demand. The US Army had its own problems in the form of shoddy suppliers. This coat, however, seems to have survived pretty well, so I can assume it was pretty well made. We do note the difference in the linings here. The Confederate one is fully lined, although again, this was homemade. It wasn't being made to a specific standard, but rather simply to match whoever was surrounding you. The Union coat is only quarter lined, but we do see conveniently here the tail pockets, which were another feature of the frock coat that would come and go out of style throughout the second half of the 19th century. But the best source I've been able to find for Army uniform frocks is this one, dating approximately the Spanish-American War. Incidentally, this one was made right here in Philadelphia by Snellenberg and Company. At one time, they were a very successful clothing wholesaler. Their main department store was at 12th and Market, which is now Reading Terminal. They were sold out to Litt Brothers, whose building is still around, but Litt Brothers themselves closed, and their headquarters is now the Five Below main offices. This coat is going to be very useful for a bit. We'll take a close look, and we can see here that this coat is again fully lined. We can see the inner breast pocket and the padding surrounding the pocket. We also notice an interesting feature of the 19th century that eventually did go out of style. The sleeve is lined with a different material from the rest of the coat. Now, you do still see this in some places, especially in couture sewing, but for these kind of mass-produced items, you really don't see that anymore. It was very popular at the time, however, that the sleeves would be using perhaps a bit more expensive, but much smoother material than the rest of the lining, since that's what your bare arm is most likely to touch. And it's really important that your sleeve not bunch up as you are trying to put this on. We can also see the collar styling here. The collar is made out of the same material as the coat. And we see this odd stretch of machine stitching that goes along the inside of the collar. I'm not entirely sure what this is here for. It may be simply machine padding the underlying support, which is something we will talk about in a little bit when we get into the actual construction of this coat here. So now I want to talk about the materials that I used to make this coat. We're getting out of the preliminary research phase and into the actual reconstruction process. For the two people who are actually in the room with me, I did bring samples so you can feel the material as we move along. The first one is the fashion fabric or main body fabric, which I am holding right here. It is a thick coating wool. Now, most materials nowadays are relative, at least to what was popular in the Victorian era, very thin. So it is difficult to do this kind of work with modern materials, but I was lucky to find something that is about the right weight. It's also very thick. It's somewhat water resistant. Now, I wouldn't want to dive in a pool with this, but if I'm walking around in the rain, this is going to do a pretty good job of keeping the clothes underneath it dry. The interfacing and interlining and other structural supports are mainly done with a horsehair canvas, which is exactly what it sounds like. It has horsehair woven into the cotton thread that makes up the majority of the body of it. I also used muslin for a great deal of the inner support structure. Muslin, of course, is a very cheap fabric. It's basically cheesecloth. Cheesecloth is just food-grade muslin. I also used linen and cotton stay tape in a lot of places, which we have pictures of right here, and is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a roll of fabric that is well cut at the edges so that I don't have to worry about it fraying once it's put in, and does a decent job of protecting whatever it is attached to. Finally, the lining. In keeping with the historical trend, I used two different linings. This light cotton, almost see-through, but not quite, provides the main body of the lining and the pocketing material. It's pretty strong and it's pretty comfortable, especially compared to the wool, which is a bit itchy. But for the sleeves and collar lining, which are the most sensitive areas, I found this glorious glazed cotton at the thrift store. Great find. At least I assume it's a glazed cotton. I did a burn test. It is natural fiber, and I'm going to assume nobody would have parted with this much silk on purpose. So now we're going to get into the patterning of the coat itself. My main source for the pattern is the American Garment Cutter, written by Samuel Regal and published by the American Fashion Company. This is a remarkable book for anyone interested in late Victorian and Edwardian men's garments, and it has a number of styles that had largely actually gone out of style by the Edwardian era, but were being kept for various uniform purposes. I found out during this project, while trying to dig up some citation information for this book, that there was a 4th edition that I was unaware of, but I was using the 3rd edition for most of it because it wasn't until putting this presentation together that I found out there was a 1924 edition. The 4th edition, quite helpfully, does have a decent amount of information about Templars, including the variations on their uniforms that were popular in the United States at that time. This includes the single-breasted straight front frock with a standing collar, which is also referred to in the text as a clergyman's frock, as well as the fatigue coat, which was formerly worn by naval officers. And in the 3rd edition, it's also listed as a bicycle policeman's blouse. Here we see Regal's drawing and my work importing Regal's drawing into modern pattern drafting software. We can see that it translates pretty well. Regal's methods do work very well with modern pattern drafting software, which is another reason why I highly recommend the book for anybody who is interested in historical circa 1900 tailoring projects, simply because the book's methods do a great job of translating for modern software. A lot of earlier methods involve quite a lot more fudging around with your pencil and your chalk to just get the lines where they're supposed to be. Regal is very detailed in his plans and execution. I take the draft as it was and then line out the shapes. Here I've tried to use different colors to make them a bit more clear. The outer body, as we saw before. Now the lining and facing and canvas are cut slightly differently. And of course the two-part sleeve from a different diagram. Other portions of the lining are more or less as we see here. There are a few places where you have to make some slight adjustments to make them fit. And now we can get to the really good part, all the pretty pictures. Here's going to be one of our useful sources for the interior construction of the coat itself, because of course, underneath this, there are several layers of canvas, linen, tape, and wadding used to fill out that ideal Edwardian silhouette. A lot of people will look at pictures from the Victorian and Edwardian era and assume that people must have had absurd body proportions, but no. This coat has padding in it to give it the ideal 1900 men's silhouette. One of my best sources for the actual construction project was How to Make a Cutaway Frock by H.M.N. Wright. Wrote a series of entries into a trade journal from around 1901 to 1903. Telling the story of a journeyman coat maker named Mr. Thimble and his meticulous instructions on how he puts together a cutaway frock or morning coat, which still gives me a lot of information about the interior construction of the earlier frock coat. Unfortunately, Wright never finished the serial. It cuts off abruptly in November of 1903 with the phrase, "to be continued." It was never continued. Here are the mock-ups. The first mock-up was too small, and I discovered a very important mistake that I should never, ever make again. When I printed out the pattern to glue together and cut out, I forgot to check that the printer was actually printing to scale. It had very helpfully added additional margins. This coat was much too small. I struggled to even put it on the dummy here and physically could not get my arms into it. The second mock-up, however, with the corrected to scale pattern fit. Now, for this project, to hopefully simplify things, I attached most of the internal structure to the mock-up itself. This allowed me to practice Mr. Thimble's methods on something that wouldn't matter. If it didn't work, no loss. If it did, I cut it out and then attached the entire thing attached to the muslin to the internal structure of the actual coat itself. Here we can see the tape, the canvas, a second layer of canvas right here on the upper portion of the chest, which helps to give it that ideal shape, and the padding, which fills in where your body naturally loses a bit of space right here at the shoulder. Now I cut out all of the pieces. I thread marked the entire thing so that I would be able to see the actual stitching lines from either side of the fabric. The thread marking also helps to keep these basted together while I am cutting them out. I added inlays as recommended in the earlier text I mentioned. The inlay is just a little bit of extra fabric outside of the seam allowance, which is there so that I can do adjustments and alterations as I go along. Here we see the body panels attached to each other. This is with no structure, no lining, literally just the back panel, the side panel, the front, and the skirt all attached to each other. And we can see that the wool is stiff enough that it really wants to hold its shape. Now I insert the canvas, tape, and the rest of the structure. This is going to go a long way towards really padding it out and making it fit that ideal Edwardian silhouette. Close-up structure. Now we can see once I actually had this basted into place, the basting stitches on one side are still visible. I then catch stitched all the way around the edges to hold that in. Now these were very delicate prick stitches. They were meant to go into the wool, but not through the wool, which is why we do not see anything on the outside. This is very tedious because it can only be done by hand, but it really does add to the effect. It gives you a wonderful coat. You cannot see what the structure is that is giving you that look. Now we attach the facing and linings. We can also see the breast pockets. This coat has 4 glorious pockets, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. This is the lining fully attached to the coat. Unfortunately, this is about where Mr. Thimble's instructions run out. So I was doing a lot of guessing at this point, and I'm pretty sure I did not do it the way Mr. Thimble would have. This was involved a lot of delicate work in awkward positions that I'm sure if Mr. Thimble had finished writing, I would have been able to avoid. But at least now I know better. And as I mentioned, pockets. This coat has 4 pockets. There are the 2 breast pockets and 2 tail pockets. As I mentioned earlier, tail pockets seem to go in and out of style throughout the 19th century for frock coats. In an actual army uniform frock, they seem to have served 2 potential purposes. The first is that you could put weights in the pocket that would hold down the tails during parade formations to ensure that the tails didn't billow too much. They would give you this kind of ideal shape in the back. You wouldn't have to worry about your tail flying out. However, on the march, it appears that soldiers mainly just kept a flask in there. Once the linings were inserted on either side, I closed and pressed the seams. Every seam in here does have to be pressed after it is made because this wool is very bulky otherwise. Now, one of the things that is recommended in one of my sources about Victorian tailoring is that a modern iron is far too light to do the job. An antique iron was just a solid piece of iron with a leather grip you put on the stove. It had enough weight to just press these seams down, even if they weren't wet. The modern home iron relies on steam, so the pressing process took a bit longer than it might have for Mr. Thimble, but it still works. After this, I attached the buttons. Actually, I have those 2 slides out of order. The buttons go on before the facing. This allows me to hide the knots that are keeping them in place. There's an extra piece of canvas back there to help reinforce where the button stand is. Once that is done, then the facing goes on over it. Finally, with both halves of the coat made up, I can put the sleeves in. And as we all know, sleeves are the devil's work. Making the sleeves took an hour. Putting them in took a day. But here they are. They finally fit appropriately. There was a lot of basting, checking, unbasting, rebasting, over and over and over again, but they are finally in. Mr. Thimble recommends that any extra fullness get pushed to the back and the armpit. This gives it a little extra give for the higher range of motion and a little extra give back here, again, to help with the shoulder blade motion. And finally, we reach the collar. Now, as mentioned, I assume that those straight stitches we saw in the Snellenberg coat were a form of machine padding. I did attempt to pad stitch something on here. I have the sample over there. I did learn how to pad stitch. A lot of the internal structure is actually pad stitched in place. But for the collar, I used machine stitching because in the actual extant example I could see, that seems to be what they did. That is, of course, the lining piece because the pad stitching will want to make it fold in. That is attached to, of course, the outer wool layer, flipped inside out, clipped and pressed. And finally, we have this just magnificent, if a bit unfinished coat. The collar attachment was yesterday afternoon. So what is left is to actually cut and finish the buttonholes, to do the cuffs, and to finish hemming the coat, in addition to removing all the still visible basting stitches. But that is just finishing. It's all fairly simple. And then this magnificent coat will be ready just in time for summer, when it will not be remotely weather appropriate. Does anybody have any questions I can answer?
So did you ever determine who H.M. Enright was?
Oh, H.M. Enright, not a clue. It's a pretty remarkable name, so you would think if we managed to find anything about him, it would have turned up somewhere, but no. He wrote in that journal. The editors actually praise his serial in every issue it appears in, but then when they stopped publishing it, there is no mention in the next issue or for the entire next year of that periodical. We tried, I asked around for some people who do have access to more obituary records, can't find anything about him. His name appears in that journal and only that journal. Anybody else? Yeah. Thank you very much for coming and listening. I guess if nobody else has any comments, we can wrap things up here. I do want to take some time, though, to admire the coat's interior structure and a few of its other features, if nobody minds. The tail pockets in particular are something I'm very interested in because, again, these are kind of unique to the era. And what we find is that simply following Mr. Thimble's instructions, this rear pocket here is so comfortably large, I can easily slide my cell phone into it. He could not possibly have anticipated I was going to need it to do that, and yet here we are. You can see the pocket tucked away right back here. It's nearly invisible until I open it. In fact, if I put my pocket in there, I'll have trouble getting it back out. This pocket is so big. The coat itself fits me reasonably well, which I should hope since I was using my measurements when I drafted it. And of course, the breast pockets. One thing I have learned through historical tailoring is that the Victorians loved their pockets, not just in their coats. Skirts, trousers, everything had to have voluminous pockets. I debated inserting a watch pocket into this, but decided against it. I felt it ruined the feel. And of course, the sleeves have not been hemmed yet, which is why they look a bit large. We'll also notice here the distinction between the two lining types. Once the sleeves were successfully inserted, I whip stitched the sleeve to the main body lining. This is one of the few places after I ran out of Mr. Thimble's instructions that I am confident I actually did correctly. The lining is felled down everywhere it intersects. The collar, of course, again, felled down. The back lining is slightly larger than the actual back body panels. This allows me to put a little pleat in here. So again, the lining has a bit of extra give, which it needs when it is being genuinely worn. Now, I have not fully removed all of the thread marks. The tails are a really interesting part of this particular style of coat. Again, we don't see skirts in men's coats anymore, but the frock features a divided skirt in the rear. Now this, at least according to the sources I have found, is a descendant of the riding coat. You would have wanted two sets of tails so you could sit in a saddle comfortably. There are meant to be two buttons up here. Now, in the earliest days of the frock, that was so you could button the tail up to keep it out of the way while you were riding. But by the mid 19th century, by the time the frock coat itself really became popular, those were entirely decorative. Nobody was doing that anymore. I think that's, thank you very much, everybody, for coming or listening. I hope you enjoyed it. But that's really all I have to say about this coat at the moment.